My presentation and research paper is on the Magi in medieval art. There is a biblical foundation for this artistic representation, and in the Bible, there are three accounts of the Magi that relate to the imagery. The first is an Old Testament foretelling, the second is the New Testament scripture in Matthew, and then there is a link to the Nativity in Luke chapter 2. The Old Testament foretelling is in Numbers 24:17. It says, I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. In the New Testament, in the book of Matthew, chapters 1 through 12, there are two main verses that describe the artistic representation of the Magi. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star that they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The Magi and the Nativity is an important theme in the artistic representations of the Magi because even though there is no mention of the Magi in Luke 2, verses 1 through 40, the actual scripture that talks about the nativity of Christ has been tied to the images of the Magi and embellished over time. So this is another scripture that's linked to the Magi. In the early Christian period, funerary art like wall paintings in the catacombs and sculpture on sarcophagi were a continuation of pagan practices, and the new subject matter expressed Christian doctrine and belief. Mosaics decorating basilicas also included signs and symbols that were borrowed from the Romans and translated into Christian context. I will not go into the style of each of these periods because there is so much to talk about and so little time. So I'm going to provide a link at the end so that you can go back and you can read about the style and look at the different works of art more closely. But the meaning of the early Christian Magi relates to processional scenes of gifting, tribute, and adoration. Representations of the Magi connect Christ to the Gentiles and their salvation. The Magi approach in a procession, slightly bowing at the waist, which recalls Roman ceremony, and the emperor. The citizen approaches the ruler in an act of submission. It relates to Christ as king and ruler of all. The kingly gifts offered by the Magi represent sacrifices to Christ, connecting the Christian to the sacrifice made by Christ on the cross and the promise of eternal salvation. The star represents the mystical sign described in the Bible, but also connects to Emperor Constantine's celestial vision at the Milvian Bridge when he saw the Greek cross aflame with the words, "In this sign conquer," in 312. The art of the Magi in the Byzantine period can be seen in mosaics and basilicas and sculptural reliefs on sarcophagi. The meaning of this artwork is a continuation of processional scenes of gifting, tribute, and adoration, but the focus really shifts to powerful propaganda, political statements of rulers. Representations of the Magi connect the Byzantine people as the chosen people of God, and the wide-eyed stares bring the viewer into contemplation with the viewer. The procession of the Magi in the Byzantine period becomes a heavenly approach to the divine and a symbol of Byzantine ceremony and political authority. The gifts offered by the Magi are connected to offerings made by temporal rulers of the world who act as representatives for the church and the people. The Magi are now known as the Three Kings, which legitimizes the rulers as God's representatives on earth. The art of the Magi in Islamic art is very interesting because there are very few representations of the Magi. The subject had absolutely no relation to the Islamic faith. The Magi were connected to the Median tribes that lived in the ancient Iran from 1000 to 549 BC, and they practiced an ancient Iranian religion, which was a form of Zoroastrianism or Mithra worship, and members of their priesthood were called Magi. So there are very few sources relating to the Median people, but Herodotus writes about them and provides an account of their services as priests for the Persians. Their priestly caste also played a significant role in the court of the Median kings as advisors, dream interpreters, and soothsayers. What's interesting is that classical historians believe the Magi were priests of the Zoroastrian faith, and this connection to Persia provided the basis for the visual representations of the Magi as exotic foreign kings. The art of the Magi during the Carolingian period can be seen in fine metalwork like reliquaries, liturgical objects, and illustrated books. These were adorned with abstract ornamentation and precious gems, and other works of art included manuscripts, sculpture, architecture, and carved ivories. The meaning of the Magi in the Carolingian period were processional scenes of gifting, tribute, and adoration, but there is an element of triumph now. The representations of the Magi continue in a procession, but the overall message begins to shift to triumphant motifs, both earthly and heavenly triumphs, and kingly power. The Magi now mirror the kingship of the earthly ruler, confirming power and the right to rule. The Magi are represented now at different ages and are also represented with different physical features in the procession images, which is an artistic evolution from the biblical account. Classical learning and intellectualism can now be seen in representations of the Magi as well. The figures have more movement and are posed with different gestures and expressions. The art of the Magi during the Ottonian period can be seen in fine metalwork like reliquaries, liturgical objects, and illustrated books. And other works of art included manuscripts, sculpture, architecture, and carved ivories. The meaning of the Ottonian Magi can be seen in processional scenes of gifting, tribute, and adoration, but in this period the Magi become kingly and are depicted wearing crowns. Representations of the Magi continue in a procession. However, the overall message begins to a full shift to represent kingly power and the divine rule of the king. The Magi are also represented with a certain flair or pageantry, which is connected to the cultural climate associated with feudalism, knights, and chivalry. The Magi are depicted with elaborate displays of wealth and gifts, which mirrors the courtly society and veneration of the ruler. The art of the Magi in the Romanesque period can be seen in architecture with monumental sculpture on church facades, doorways, and capitals, and illuminated manuscripts and freestanding works of art in wood and metal. The meaning of Romanesque Magi relates to gifting, tribute, and adoration, but representations tell stories filled with drama and emotion. Now you have biblical scenes from the story of the Magi and Nativity that are woven together on church facades and capitals, which create a unique language that communicates the tenets of the Christian faith, including religious devotion and acts of thanksgiving. The story of the Magi in Matthew is connected to the biblical account of the Nativity in Luke, which creates a more dynamic tale of Christ's rule and piety. Overall, the biblical account of the Magi in Matthew is embellished and artistic licenses taken in order to tell a more dramatic story infused with mysticism and mystery. The art of the Magi in the Gothic period can be seen in, well, that's wrong. It's not funerary art, wall paintings in the catacombs, and sculpture on sarcophagi. It's actually on church architectural elements, illuminated manuscripts, and stained glass windows. The meaning of the Gothic Magi is representations in Gothic art relates to the Capetian kings and their association with Old Testament kings and the Christian Roman emperors. The story of the Magi is embellished with mystical imagery related to the star, angelic visions, and the Nativity. Depictions of the Magi also relate to divinely inspired journeys and the Crusades. The Magi appear on horseback and on a sacred journey. The story of the Magi is frequently part of a larger narrative of other stories from the Bible, which relate to the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ and the relationship between the kings and clergy. Also, the overall narrative included the relationship between the earthly kings and queens and those in the New Testament, specifically King Solomon, and the important understanding that the people of France were the new chosen people of God.